Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story I am talking about today is episode 81 of my ongoing series, Worth 1,000 Words. And if you are new here, it is where I write a 1,000 word short story inspired by a piece of artwork. But today it was also somewhat inspired by something else. I'm reading Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant, and it is kind of a dreamy, leisurely fantasy, literary fantasy. And so this artwork I found kind of reminded me of it, at least tonally. And so the soundtrack I went with was the Green Knight soundtrack by Daniel Hart. And I should have listened to it beforehand because there is a lot of vocalization. There's a lot of singing in it that was a little bit distracting. And toward the end, I'll talk about a little bit more workflow stuff, some lessons I learned. Before we get into that, let us check out this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled Sleeper, and it's by an artist named Tomas Ducek out of Prague, Czech Republic. This one's very reminiscent of a story I did a while back where a dying man was being consumed by the forest itself and these kind of wood spirits, I guess. But this one, he is completely alone. You can see the roots seemingly consuming him. He's waist deep into the earth and becoming one with it. So some other details here are his cloak, which is tattered and torn, and he's got a couple of ornamental things around his neck. But something most curious is on his hand, and it looks to be a wedding ring. So I think that will be a great aspect to figure out this man's tale, because there's not really an inherent conflict here. It looks like a guy who is sleeping or dead in a forest, nothing peeking out behind the trees in the background or any other indication of what got this guy here. So Tomas, thank you for the artwork, and let's see what I came up with. The sough of the wind chattered the branches, carrying a memory. His name, his story, his love. For a love he must have had once. So said the ring encircling his finger, which encircled the roots of the forest bed, which was his bed, among the snow and moss and earth. Who was that love? The memory carried by the wind was too high, too agile, too fickle, too unwilling to reveal its secrets, content in eluding him, until it bored of that, and the forest was silent again. That silence did not leave a space for his mind to discover what the wind had teased. It only enlisted a weight upon his eyelids to bring him to slumber. He closed his eyes, for it was all he could do. His dreams were dark, a starless sky, a cave, a well. At the bottom of that well shone a coin, golden like the metal on his finger, what imagery stamped upon it too fine to decipher. He swam through the pitch and reached out what he imagined was his hand, for he could not see it either, waiting for his fingers to occlude the coin and then the sensation of its surface to manifest. Such a small thing could buy so much. He felt his mouth salivating at the thought of the feast it could yield. Mutton and bread and cheese, washed down by sweet mead, which he would slam down on the table to demand more, more, more. And there would be a woman. His love? No, for she was laden in bruises makeup couldn't cover, though cover it she tried, even angling her body in such a way to favor her unblemished side to the firelight. This coin could buy flesh, and he wasn't a choosy man, not yet, not until he found his love. Tonight was not for love, and he hungered for what love was not. He took her hand and stood, and with a turn of her head she showed him a hoop in her ear, polished to the coin's luster. He reached for it, but could not grasp it, instead pulled stumbling up the stairs by the woman, who deposited him in a room as dark as a cave. Blind as he was, he probed the darkness for a hint of wall or anything. Nothing he felt, but something he saw. The elusive color tuned to the sound of the wind. He lunged for it and found a shuttered window where a golden orb gleamed. The coin, he thought at first, but his fingers went through it as if it were a ring. A knothole he found, splinters as well, and through that knothole shone the sun. He threw open the window to find anything but the sun. Darkness is what he saw, but at its core lay that coin, that permanent fixture of his madness, still out of reach. Still, he reached. He crawled. Hands and knees pressed against stone, cut into them. Jagged and fierce, it rent his flesh, yet still he pressed on, his eyes on the prize, because love could wound him more than stone. Walls rose, so he stood, blood trickling into his boots, which gripped the stone well enough, rooted him nearly. Careful steps he took, gaze flicking to the ground as if he could see it, until he heard the hammer and clink and eventual clatter of what could only be iron to stone. Something did occlude the coin then. Something hunched and ragged with a crude swath of ink set over its shoulder, only to blur before he could make sense of it. A creature, a trial, to prove his worthiness of what he knew he had already won. His finger lay absent of that, but of course it did. Him having yet to conquer what stood before him, seething with its weapon ready to feed upon something more substantial than teeth of rock. He charged forward with a bellow, his only weapon, and the creature did stir, did take notice, but lash out at him it did not. It eclipsed what could only be the cave's entrance, as if to steal his prize, to never attain what mystery the wind sang. A gasp broke through his shout, as his hands took hold, and another glimmer hovered in the dark, a ring encircling a finger, catching what little light remained, and it would be his. He let his hands do the work, bringing this creature to its end before its blade found him. And when his strength was spent, he looked again to be sure he had won. And there, staring back, was a tooth and a maw with no others, because he had taken them with his fist, silver as the moon in a starless sky. He saw just that. Then the moon itself faded away, and he was left with the sough of the wind tuned to a chime, hanging from the eave of a cottage of a dead man, at the edge of a lake near a forest, with twisted roots that whispered through undulating soil, like maggots just below the surface, feeding on the rotten flesh, hidden by the skin of the earth. He followed the whispers, as he had followed so many things, first at the bottom of a well, then in a chamber of lust, through a cave with a beast that was but a toothless man who had perished from his touch. When his eyes opened, he wanted to close them again, for he knew now why he was here. His ring was no ring to represent love, for he had none. The forest told him what the wind had not, whispering his deeds now that he was close enough to hear them, consumed by the roots to the waist, for he was not a man of love. The ring a trinket taken from a man who had loved. His eyes closed, for it was all he could do. Welcome to the end, dear viewer. I'm so glad you made it. This is where I talk about my final thoughts. What I liked, what I didn't like, what I learned, and there are some things to be learned in this one. It was a little bit of a misfire on my part, so let us just get into the writing right away. So what I was trying to do here is figure out, what is this guy's story? This guy who is lying seemingly dead in the forest, being consumed by the earth and the roots. But maybe he's just sleeping. Maybe that's it, because that is the title of the artwork. And there were very few clues in this to give me kind of an inspiration as to what brought him to this state. And the one I went with, the most prominent one, was the ring upon his finger, which was a wedding ring. And what I wanted to do here at the very beginning, you can see that I was bringing the sough of the wind, chattered the branches, carrying a memory. So I just pictured this guy sitting here kind of out of it, kind of, either semi-awake or not awake at all, and he's just hearing something. And clearly I decided, because The Buried Giant, the novel I'm reading, is all about there's a strange mist falling over the land. It's making people forget. And so that, again, inspired this piece a little bit. And so he's trying to remember his name, his story, his love, because that is where we get right off the bat with his ring. He spots this ring on his finger. And immediately I put him into the sleeping state, the state you find him in the artwork. And this imagery just popped into my head: a starless sky, a cave, a well. And then we see him diving down into this well, seeking out this ring. But then he gets a memory of something else, and or not a memory, but an image of something else. Maybe it's a memory. He decides to think about the value of this coin, and he envisions himself in an inn, in a tavern of some kind, eating mutton and bread and sweet mead. But then he sees a woman. After he demands more of this feast, he demands more and more and more. and there would be a woman. His love, no, she is just a barmaid, let's say, but he decides to take advantage because he realizes this coin could buy flesh, and he wasn't a choosy man, not yet, not until he found his love. And so I think you can tell what I was trying to do throughout the story is not only tell this guy's tale, but paint him in a light or have a realization at the very end that he wasn't the man who he thought maybe he was, because he's looking at this ring and he immediately thinks, oh, I was married at one time. And I could have gone that route. It might have been a better story because there are some definite failings here, which I'll talk about. And so he goes up into this room and then she pushes him in there and it's dark, but then he finds this. Again, another hint of the coin, which the elusive color tuned to the sound of the wind, and he lunges for it and he finds a shuttered window. But when he opens that window, he finds himself in the cave, which is the second image that I wrote down. And in that cave, he finds what he thinks is a creature, but ends up being a man that he pummels to death, essentially, because he fears for his life. And there's this imagery of him eclipsing the coin. So that to him represents someone else taking what he is seeking, as if to steal his prize, you can see right here, to never attain what mystery the wind sang. And so he takes what he believes is his, and it ends in a staring back at him was a tooth and a maw with no others, because he had taken them with his fists, silver as the moon and a starless sky. Which brings us to the third and the final image. It takes him to, again, the sound of the wind, which was I was trying to make a persistent element throughout the story, kind of guiding you through this, almost like a trigger of a memory. And that takes him to a cottage of a dead man. So presumably the man he killed at the edge of a lake near a forest, the forest in which he's in, with the twisted roots that whisper through undulating soil. And this is a hell of a long sentence. This is kind of giving sort of the meaning of where he is going to go next. A little bit of foreshadowing, I guess, where undulating soil like the maggots just below the surface, feeding on the rotten flesh hidden by the skin of the earth. So, which he is about to join. And so he followed these whispers into the forest. But like he had so many other things, first the bottom of a well, then in a chamber of lust, through a cave with a beast that was but a toothless man who had perished by his touch. And so now he opens his eyes, finally awakened from this dream, temporarily though, and he knows why he is here. His ring was no ring to represent love, for he had none. The forest told him what the wind had not, whispering his deeds now, that he was close enough to hear them, consumed by the roots, and on and on and on. So he realizes that this ring didn't really have a happy ending. It doesn't have a happy story of him having a family or just a wife maybe and a nice life. This was him being a thief, a rogue in the night who acquired this by violent means. So what are the failings here? Well, this is a story that has more elements. There are elements there. I think there are things that I was trying to piece together. I was trying to figure out who this guy was, what his story was. And in the beginning, I thought the easiest thing would be to go to the ring, and maybe he had a past life, maybe he had a happy life, and maybe he came here to die. Maybe his family had moved on, and he was the last one left, and so he kind of walked in the story to die. And that might have been a little bit closer to something like The Buried Giant, where it's a little more thoughtful, it's a little bit more paced out, it's a little bit slower. But then while I was midway writing this thing, I said, well, what if I make this guy have a realization? Maybe he has a dream or an image of himself, who he thinks he is. And in fact, at the very end, he learns that he is not that great man. He did not have a family. He did not have a wife. But this ring just represents something he stole. And while those elements are there, I feel like there's just not enough significance of where he got the ring. I just kind of mention it in an aside. So I think to make this story better, there needs to be a moment where he steals this ring. Maybe he puts on his finger because he's posing as a married man for some reason. I have no idea. Maybe he not only steals that ring, but he uses it for selfish purposes or something like that. And then I think there'd be a lot more meaning there. But unfortunately, that just didn't come. And another thing I'd like to mention, normally I write these in one sitting, and I did write this in one sitting, kind of. I had to kind of stop here and there, so it was probably about 3 different writing sessions with gaps in between. And it took me a really long time. It probably took me over 2 hours to write this. And so one thing I've noticed is now, while that timing does happen from time to time when I just sit and go, usually it doesn't. Usually I'm just barely over an hour, like an hour and 15. That seems to be my average. And what I learned from this is it really taught me that when I'm working on my longer form stuff, the power of just sitting down and doing a sprint, whatever that may be. Maybe it's 20 minutes, maybe it's an hour, Maybe it's 5 minutes, who knows? Staying in the flow state. Even if you're stuck, even if you're not sure where to go next, make sure that you're still working on this. You're not looking at the internet, you're not checking messages and stuff like that, which unfortunately I had to do. Now I know better. I was trying to squeeze this in a little bit earlier than usual, so I'd have my evening free, and I should have just really dedicated some time to go through this in its entirety without stopping. A lesson I have learned for myself in my novel work, which I do from time to time, peck through it here and there. If I have 5 minutes, if I have 10 minutes, I might open it up, close it down, whatever I got to do, whatever time I have. But now I know, I think it is more productive to have a dedicated time for your session and then leave it be. Chipping away at it seems to break my flow quite a bit, break my thought process, which just leads to a very arduous and longer writing session. I'm not sure how you work. Normally I work in sprints. This time I didn't really. I kind of sort of did, and those stops and those starts really hurt my process. If you are one of those people who are pecking away at things here and there, I highly recommend you try to dedicate some time, close everything down, don't look at your phone, don't look at any messages, and then just write. And don't forget, if you'd like to support the channel, give me a like, subscribe for story-related content. You can check out my books, my Discord, everything's in the description below. And keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.